have your seat. Yeah.
All right, we're going to get started, everybody. So if you could please take your seats. Just a very quick note, in your folders, we have comment cards. It's the only way we know whether you're enjoying our conferences or not, so please take the time to fill them out before you leave and leave them at the registration desk. We would appreciate it. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Deborah Amos, who will be running the show. She is a former colleague of mine at National Public Radio and a dear friend who has covered Iraq extensively for NPR, in addition to many other countries in the Middle East. She's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and returned to working with NPR after a decade in television news, including stints with ABC's Nightline, World News Tonight, and the PBS program Now. She's also just about to have a book come out, and the name of the book, Deborah, well, when it comes out in a month's time, you'll find out the title. So let me hand the panel over to Deborah.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to this panel on the future of Iraq. And you may think that it's folly to predict the future of a country in 2020 as our panel is billed, but I think that you will hear that our panelists will be a little closer to the present. There's some immediate good news about Iraq. The parliament passed an election law. There's an identity in the country that's emerging that appears to be more secular, more nationalist. The sectarian divide appears to be blurring. The recent bombings, the ones in August and then in October, didn't ignite a sectarian revenge cycle. Of course, the bombers made no distinctions at all between Sunnis and Shiites, and the segregated neighborhoods in the country mourned without reprisals. Ahead of the national elections, Sunni politicians have been courted by powerful Shiites. It's a kind of political speed dating to find willing and acceptable partners to prove nationalist credentials. In some ways, the politicians are running to catch up with the population. There's serious fault lines that I think that our panelists will address. The tensions between Iraq's Arabs and Kurds over not just Kirkuk, but the future of Kurdistan is now considered, certainly by American commanders, as the most serious divide in the country. Transparency International lists Iraq as one of the 3 most corrupt countries in the world. And there's still a serious brain drain as more people want to leave. The earlier mass exodus, some 2 million Iraqis left the country and another 2 million were displaced, has barely been reversed. Relations with the neighbors are more fraught than ever, and I think we have to ask this panel if Iraq's institutions are strong enough to survive after the Americans pull out. We have a great panel to ask these very hard questions. Each is going to speak for 15 minutes, and if I read all of their bios, that would be the entire afternoon. So I'm going to give you a short introduction. And I'm going to start with our first speaker, Michael Corbin, who has enormous street cred in the region. In July of this year, he was appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Near East Affairs for Iraqi issues, but prior to him coming back to Washington, he was posted and served in Baghdad, in Damascus, and Cairo. Ren Franke has ground truth from Iraq. Not only was she born there, she's just come back from there. She's the executive director and co-founder of the Iraq Foundation, dedicated to promoting democracy and human rights in Iraq. She represented her country in Washington. She was one of Iraq's first ambassadors after the fall of Saddam, and she makes frequent trips to Baghdad, and she's a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute for Peace. Ali Allawi, he's the guy who follows the money. He's a visiting senior fellow at the Kennedy School of Government's Carr Center. He's been a Minister of Trade, a Minister of Defense, a Minister of Finance in Iraq, as well as a sharp critic of Washington policy in his book, Winning the War, Losing the Peace. And finally, but certainly not least, James Dobbins. He also follows the numbers. He's the director of the International Security and Defense Policy Center at RAND. He was the Bush administration's special envoy to Afghanistan, and he raised the flag on the newly reopened U.S. embassy there. He's been a special envoy in Kosovo, Bosnia, Haiti, and Somalia. And Mr. Dobbins was quoted in just about every article critical of truth strength in Iraq in those early days after he published an extensive study on how many troops you actually need to pacify a country. I'd like to welcome all of our panelists, and we will start with you, Ambassador Dobbins.
Thank you. Well, the ultimate test of any effort at post-conflict stabilization and reconstruction is whether you can leave behind a society that's at peace with itself and its neighbors. I think we can debate whether the intervention in Iraq was necessary. I think we can also debate whether or not, on balance, it was beneficial. But I do think there's a reasonable chance that we'll meet that particular test. That is, that we will be able to leave behind a society at peace with itself and its neighbors, although this is by no means assured. Rand published a report a couple of months ago that was mandated by the U.S. Congress, looking at American plans to withdraw from Iraq and critiquing and evaluating them. And Rand, first of all, looked at the sources of the threat to Iraqi stability and concluded that the principal threats did not come from marginal extremists, from al-Qaeda or from elements outside the political system, that in fact the main threats came from elements that are currently in the political system but might withdraw from it under some conditions. And I'll go through some of these threats. The threat that Rand assessed as the most serious, and Deborah's already mentioned this, is not the tensions between Shia and Sunni, but the tensions between Arab and Kurds. And this is most dangerous because these are the factions that are most heavily armed, for one thing, and therefore most capable of actually sustaining a large-scale civil war, and not the kind of irregular civil war that you saw in 2006, 2007, in which only one side had heavy weapons and a capacity to take and hold territory, but in which both sides have that capacity. And in that kind of civil conflict, casualties tend to escalate, refugees tend to escalate. It's a much more violent type of conflict. And so that's the rift that could be most dangerous, most difficult to handle. And it may also be the more likely. A second, of course, is the familiar Shia-Sunni divide. And there is continuing tensions which could again become a source of violence on a large scale. And finally, there's Shia-Shia tensions, that is, between the more extreme factions like those associated with Mukhtar al-Assad and those that are more mainstream and more thoroughly integrated into the political system. Now, at the moment, can I have the water, please, Ellie? Now, at the moment, all of these are inside the tent. They're all participating in the political system. And the objective, obviously, should be to keep them in that system, which means, among other things, that they all need to perceive benefits from participating in that system. A study of post-conflict reconstruction shows that the most dangerous period in these kinds of societies is not the run-up to elections. In the run-up to elections, everybody's on their best behavior. They're trying to win votes. It's the aftermath of elections in which the decisions, the power-sharing decisions have been made, and there are inevitably relative losers. And these relative losers are not, there's no tradition of good losers or loyal opposition, and so this is the period of sort of maximum danger. And I think we saw that with the last Iraqi elections, that the greater violence occurred after the elections, not before. So the fact that things are fairly quiet at the moment shouldn't be too much of a source of confidence that they couldn't get worse. Now, in addition to the internal sources of conflict, which I've mentioned. There are obviously the important effect of external actors, and in particular of Iraq's near neighbors. And there, our report assessed that the only neighbor that was likely to intervene overtly was Turkey. That Turkey is the only neighbor that would, under conceivable circumstances, and actually quite conceivable circumstances, actually invade Iraq. It's done so periodically over the last several years, and it could do so again with much higher levels if provoked under certain conditions. And indeed, this could easily be one of the consequences of a deterioration in Arab-Kurdish relations. The countries that are likely to intervene covertly would be Syria and Saudi Arabia on behalf of the Sunnis, and Iran on behalf of the Shia, and indeed potentially Iran on behalf of some Shia as opposed to others, although by and large Iran has hedged its bet and provided support to all of the Shia factions. Again, we don't assess any of these interventions as likely, at least at high levels, unless a deterioration of relationships among the main Iraqi actors that are in the political system at the moment were to break down, offering opportunities and provoking that kind of external intervention. So what are the conclusions for American policy? First of all, we assess that the current schedule for withdrawals, which has us removing all so-called combat troops by next summer, but redefining a number of combat troops as non-combat troops in the process. So although the U.S. will withdraw a significant component of its current capabilities between the elections in ideally January and the summer, they will leave behind a number of what are called advise and assist brigades, which retain very substantial combat capabilities, although combat is not their principal mission. Their principal mission is to partner, train, and mentor Iraqi units. That the schedule under is feasible, provided the conditions that I've set out, that is, no major falling out among the main parties in the Iraqi political system develops. Secondly, that the U.S. should withdraw last from the areas that are most volatile and are most likely to become flashpoints, which include in particular the contested areas between Kurdish and Arab Iraq, like Kirkuk and other areas along that divide. That should be the last area from which U.S. troops should leave. And finally, that the U.S. needs to begin to give serious consideration to what kind of role it intends to play in Iraq and what kind of relations it wants with Iraq after 2011. The process of training and equipping and supporting Iraq's own security forces has progressed considerably over the last several years. And in many respects, these forces are increasingly capable of standing on their own and should be by the end of 2011. But there are some things that they're not going to be ready to do, including defending Iraqi airspace and assuring Iraqi sovereignty over its airspace. That's something they're not going to be able to do by the end of 2011. And there are other more limited areas where some further sort of external assistance is likely to be necessary. And one of those areas is to continue to monitor and mediate along the Arab-Kurdish divide. We don't believe, don't believe those issues will be settled by 2011. And at the moment, the U.S. is playing an important role by being in communication with both sides, by mediating individual disputes which could escalate if they were not controlled. And while you don't necessarily need a large armed force to continue to provide that, there probably does need to be some sort of external monitor and facilitator to play that role after 2011. Clearly, the U.S. needs to look at its post-2011 role in Iraq in a broader regional context. What sort of long-term role does it envision for itself in the Gulf, in the Middle East? And my personal view there is that we ought to be, over time, looking toward a return to the equilibrium that existed from the British withdrawal in the 1950s until the American entry in 1991. That is, you had a prolonged period during which there were no Western forces in the Gulf. You had visits, you had over-the-horizon presence, you had small facilities where ships could come in and refuel, but you had no ground forces and in fact, no air forces throughout the region, and the region remained stable. And it's worth remembering, as we tend to be very concerned about Iran and the rise of Iranian power, that it wasn't Iran that precipitated the American engagement in this region. It was Iraq. It was Iraq that brought us in the first time, first Gulf War. It was Iraq that kept us there after the first Gulf War. And it was Iraq that brought us in even more heavily since. And so you can conceive of an equilibrium in that region which doesn't require a major Western military presence. And I believe in the long term that ought to be our objective. I also don't believe it's an objective that can be reached early. I think that it requires a good deal of time and a changed relationship with Iran, among others, before it becomes feasible. But I do believe that it ought to be the declared U.S. long-term objective. Thank you.
Let me ask you again. We're going to put our speakers up on the podium so you in the back can see them.
First of all, I'm honored and humbled to be here in an organization that has so many people that I've followed in their footsteps who've been so successful or not in the region. But as an Arabist, I have to say when I start talking about Iraq, that Iraq was a reason that Arabists fell out of favor. Arabists are in favor now, but we never know what Iraq may do to our futures. So I stand here humbled by that prospect. It is an honor to talk about Iraq. I'm going to try and be brief to allow questions and talk about what the administration is focused on now. When I left Baghdad in July, I said I would keep to the mantra that things are changing in Iraq in a way that they haven't changed in any of the countries that I've had the pleasure of serving sometimes twice. After 3 months out of Iraq, there are changes going on every day that are significant, and for any expert to keep track of what's going on in Iraq, it's necessary to keep in touch with what's going on in the ground. That, of course, leads to the question, Iraq 2020. This is a very difficult discussion, but let me just frame what the administration is focused on and what we're working on. Really, there are two transitions that we're looking at now that we think will lay the groundwork for our relationship as we go ahead past 2012 and towards 2020. The first is the major transition from a military security driven relationship to a civilian traditional diplomatic partnership. And that's very important, and I'll talk about some of the elements there. The second is the transition that's going on within Iraq, and the transition from a government that has not that had sectarian conflict in 2006, 2007, had violence, an economy that was in shambles, to where we are now and what the prospects we see. So I'm talking about two transitions. Let me start with the military to civilian transition. We now currently have about 116,000 troops in Iraq. We're going to go down to 50,000 by August of 2010 per the President's plan. This is the withdrawal timetable. They will have a role after August of 2010, but that will be a non-combat role. But they'll still be present, and they'll still have some influence. However, what we're building now is a civilian relationship that isn't so security-driven. We have something called the Strategic Framework Agreement, which was signed with much less fanfare at the same time as the Security Agreement, the equivalent of a SOFA, what the Iraqis call the Withdrawal Agreement. The Strategic Framework Agreement provides the basis for traditional modes of diplomacy and traditional interaction with the government of Iraq in some sort of a partnership. And we have these relations around the world that vary from once-a-year partnerships to once-every-month partnerships. So when we look at the Strategic Framework Agreement, which was launched at the end of the last administration and then recertified by Hillary Clinton with Prime Minister Maliki in July, we see a framework that actually has a lot of support in Iraq. I would argue that most Iraqis, except some of the extremist trends, believe that Iraq should have a partnership with the United States, and the Strategic Framework Agreement possesses the factors necessary for that. It includes the economic cooperation, it includes cooperation in assistance, education, health, culture, and it provides a basis where we can bring to bear some of the traditional tools of diplomacy using agencies that have been present in Iraq for 6 years, but were present under a military umbrella. This is very important for the U.S. military because they view, as the U.S. military presence goes down, that there should be an increase in the U.S. civilian presence. I was the political military affairs counselor in Baghdad, and my tried and true speech was how few foreign service officers there were and how there wasn't going to be a new surge in Iraq of civilians that would equal the 116,000 that they have now. We are, however, going to go to some traditional, tried and true methods through AID, through police training, which will switch from a military program to a civilian program, to some of the traditional educational and cultural partnerships, where we'll have a better opportunity of working with the Iraqis in partnership, not under the shadow or not under the overall security concerns. This is an important transition, and it will take time. We're not going to be able to go straight from where we are today to some sort of traditional partnership overnight. This is why the 2012 date is important, because we have a time to set up these institutions and to support Iraqi institutions as we go forward. Our plan is to continue things that are sort of an aberration for diplomats. We have these things called provincial reconstruction teams. Even though we're out of the business of reconstruction, we're going to keep our provincial presence around Iraq into 2012, and that's very important. The cost of these is enormous, and we're going to have to, and it shows our commitment to be remaining engaged in Iraq, that will keep this presence around Iraq. We're also going to coordinate very closely with the advise and assist brigades that Ambassador Dobbins referred to. What will these advise and assist brigades do if they're not doing combat and training? They're going to be involved in we believe, and we're working with the military very closely, in supporting these the provincial diplomatic presence, supporting UNAMI, supporting the EU, supporting NGOs that need security support, that need logistics support. This is a very important part of our transition. The other aspects of the transition is to get the agencies that were there, such as agriculture and commerce, to move out from under the military funding umbrella, which is a wonderful umbrella to be in, given how many billions of dollars that are available there. We want a traditional commerce office, a traditional agriculture office under the Foreign Agricultural Service. We want DOJ and rule of law present, as they are in many other embassies and with many other countries around the world. And we have a basis to establish that in the platform that we've built in Baghdad and the platforms that we will have around the provinces in Iraq. This transition is not going to be easy. State resources are going to be taxed as we do this. We have the competing challenge of staffing in Afghanistan. We have the competing challenge of the number of people who have already gone to serve in Iraq. A similar factor that we have in the military is that people are going to have to go back to Iraq to help with this civilian buildup. But we're working very closely, and Ambassador Chris Hill and General Odierno in Iraq are working very closely on the parameters of this cooperation as we transition. The second transition is very important also, and that's the transition that's going on in Iraq. What I saw that was one of the most important events during my 11 months in Baghdad was the transition on January 1st of this year, when the UN mandate ended and Iraqis declared full sovereignty over their country. There really was a change in the air when that happened. Iraq is pursuing a sovereign course that depends on Iraqi institutions and the Iraqi government taking the lead in a way that represents an Iraq nationality and Iraq status. I think that elements of that are in politics. We saw that in January with the provincial elections. And though Ambassador Dobbins was correct that there was violence after the 2005 elections, there wasn't violence after the provincial elections. And in fact, people tended to accept the results, which were quite surprising. Sectarian-based parties did badly. Iranian-affiliated parties did badly. Traditional incumbents did badly. This is where we first saw the open list system where individuals were held accountable. Prime Minister Maliki and the State of Law Coalition did very well based on security and services, and we saw a real participation in the process that we believe will be reflected in the national elections. Now, these, of course, are more important. But as Deborah said at the beginning, the fact that the Parliament did come to agreement on an election law, including discussion of the issue of Kirkuk, was extremely important. If you may recall, the provincial elections went ahead without Kirkuk being included, and that led to a veto by President Talabani last summer that caused all sorts of problems. So we are seeing a political participation that we believe shows a transition in the politics. Now, as we talk about the major transition in Iraq, I think what we're looking at is politics rather than sectarian violence, and politics is going to be messy. We're going to continue to see political interests rather than the institutional interests that are so important for that society. And that's where I go back to the Strategic Framework Agreement. One of the key motivations of that agreement is to build the institutions that will continue as we go through a period of government formation, which will be the first politically messy time that we have. It took almost 5 months to create a government after 2005. Politics remains the same, and politics may even be more important, so we don't see that being necessarily a shorter period this time. We need those institutions, economic, educational. We need those links that we can work with the Iraqi government as we go forward. I think that's extremely important for our partnership and the way we'll move. I think that what's also important is to talk about Iraq's regional role. And this is where I have to say that I've seen that Maliki did confound most of the predictions, that he wouldn't be able to stand up to Iran, that he wouldn't be able, and the Iraqi political parties themselves viewed that he would be a weaker leader. And I've seen that there is an Iraqi nationalist trend that has led to a resistance to Iranian influence. I would say that when we look at how relations with Turkey, and it's quite clear that Turkey was the country that's most recently invaded Iraq, when you look at the dramatic change in 1 year in relations with Turkey, where Turkey now is working both with Baghdad and with the regional government of Kurdistan on a way forward based on shared economic interests and shared interests against terrorism. When you look at the visits by Prime Minister Erdogan, President Gül to Baghdad, Prime Minister Maliki going to Turkey, we really see that the Turkish approach, which is also domestic on how to deal with the PKK, reflects a new maturity in that relationship, which is extremely positive. One of the things that I was involved in was setting up a joint counterterrorism center aimed at the PKK in Kurdistan that include people both from Baghdad and the KRG and Turkey, which was unthinkable 2 years ago. When you look at Iran, when you look at the fact that the Iranian-affiliated parties did much more poorly in the provincial elections, when you look at the change from more hard power covert action to a much more soft power trade delegations from the Iranian side, we see that the Iraqis are making clear that they're not going to be subservient to Iranian desires. There will be, of course, influences from Iran, but we see that that's positive. Switching to the GCC, Saudi Arabia is key there. We understand that the problem with a Shia government for Saudi Arabia will remain, but we're hoping that after this election there will be an understanding that there is likely to be into the future a Shia government in Iraq that the region needs to deal with. And we saw that at the end of last month when the Egyptians had a strategic cooperation of their framework of their own, which they launched with the Iraqis. Egypt has just sent its ambassador back after the tragic assassination of an ambassador in 2003 or 2006. They've sent an ambassador now to Iraq for the first time. That link, having Sunni countries link with Iraq, is key to some of the issues that we've talked about in general. I could talk about some other relations, but I want to skip to give more chance for questions. Let me talk about challenges. Since security is always in the media, I'll start with that, although I don't think that's the biggest challenge. For me, from Yemen to Morocco, the way Arab governments deal with security threats is through effective intelligence. And I think that the high-profile attacks, the bombings of August 19th and October 25th, underlined for the Iraqis that intelligence is the key for to being able to defeat the enemy. And they need to go from 5 different intelligence services to at least coordinating their intelligence. And that's something that they are addressing, that they do realize. We see the extremists started with targeting economic infrastructure, moved to encouraging sectarian discord by mosques and churches. But now we see that they're targeting, as Deborah said at the beginning, just indiscriminately targeting buildings, government buildings, which will have no resonance in the Iraqi populace. Of course, the Kurd-Arab conflict. This is going to be something that takes years to resolve. Right now, everyone is working together because the Kurds will have a very significant role to play in government formation after the election. That's something, though, that with these coalitions that have been formed, there may be a basis for agreement after the elections. But it will be, and it will continue to be, the most potentially destabilizing issue. Roles of sectarian parties and Sunni disaffection. The Sunnis are participating in the national elections. This is key. We'll see, but they're so divided and their expectations are very high for these elections. We'll need to see what happens there after the election results are in. Sectarian parties. So far, the coalitions have focused on multi-sectarian coalitions. If Maliki joins the INA, the Shia coalition, this would be a sign that they're moving away from multi-sectarian coalitions, and that would be a bad sign. Corruption. We talked about corruption and the influence on the economic system and the political system. This is going to be something that we have to redouble our efforts to address. And the role of a strong judiciary, which is one of the things that we're promoting, is key to that, as well as a free press, which we're also very keenly focused on. One of the greatest economic dangers is return to a statist, centrally run economy. That's something that I know that is of great concern. We've had some progress, the oil bid rounds going to private international companies, but this is going to be an issue that we have to watch very closely because the tendency is centrally controlled economic policies which will not be good for the future and will not bring the private investment, which is key. Protection of minorities. It's absolutely critical that the minority populations, who unfortunately tend to be mainly in the Kurd-Arab fault lines, are protected. The government of Prime Minister Maliki has taken steps, and there are protections there, but this is going to be a continual issue that we follow. So I think that with those challenges that we're going to be addressing next year, we have a way forward that's going to be based on a strategic framework agreement and on a partnership and a commitment and a withdrawal timetable for our U.S. troops.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, my thanks first to the Middle East Institute for inviting me to speak at this forum, and thanks, Deborah, for moderating the panel. I'm glad to be speaking after Ambassador Corbyn because it gives me something to slightly punch against. Of course, as everybody knows, at midnight +5, not midnight less 5, the Iraqi parliament finally voted for an election law for the elections in January 2010. And it's as good a law as one expects, probably not what the political parties wanted, but certainly is a law that's good for the country. But the debate began last June, and I was in Iraq at that time when the debate began, and it has been fierce and acrimonious and very adversarial. And the debate encapsulated the divisions and the distrust and the uncertainties that dominate the political arena, and the fragility of the state structure and the continuing vulnerability of Iraq to external influences. All of this came together in the debate of the election law. Of course, the fact that the law was passed through debate in Parliament rather than shootout in the streets is a testament to how far Iraq has come along. There could have been a political meltdown with the help of the allies, the United States, of Sistani, and so on and so forth. There wasn't a political meltdown, and we had the law. Now, in official Washington circles, there is this myth that Iraq is now becoming a normal country. And you hear this very often, and we want to return to normal relations and so on, because Iraq is normal. Well, Iraq is anything but normal. And with good reason, actually. Iraqis are, you could say they're redefining their state. You could say they are reinventing their state. And in the process, all the received truths that Iraqis have inherited are subject to doubt, subject to questioning, rejection, and of course also subject to competing ambitions and mutual fears. Everything is on the table. And internally, Iraq suffers from tensions and conflicts that could return it to a state of chaos in 2006, and externally it is buffeted by rival agendas from its neighbors, both close and far. But in spite of the dangers, let's point out to some positive elements in Iraq, because there are many. And most of these positive elements have been cited so far, but let me just go through them very quickly. The virtual disappearance of sectarian violence, I won't say it's 100% gone, but it's almost gone. And indeed the drop in all kinds of violence in Iraq, despite the uptick over the last few months, which I think is also connected to the elections and is likely to go past the elections through the formation of a government. But the violence, unlike the violence previously, is not to overthrow the new state, but to shape it to the will and the image that those perpetrators wish. This is how I would explain it, that it is an effort to mold the political process rather than to negate it entirely. And the impact of this violence is on the political process, on the social fabric, is far less damaging than the sectarian killings that we saw in 2006 and 2007, which really did threaten to undermine the entire Iraqi state and society. The other positive parts of the procedure is, as mentioned, the disaffection of the population at large with the use of religion as a symbol for politics in the political process, and the recognition, finally, by the political elite that they must respond to this rejection of the population. And therefore, the political parties have been compelled to take on a more national rhetoric, to move away at least from overt sectarian rhetoric, and to begin to project national platforms. Now, whether this is sincere or not is another question, but the mere fact that the political parties are moving in that direction is in itself a positive factor. And the fact that they're responding to public opinion on this is an important positive element. We now actually have public opinion in Iraq, whether it's through the press, whether it's through non-governmental associations and so on, that can have an impact on the political process, and that's a big advantage. The very fluidity, and I would say the sort of protean nature of the political scene is encouraging. If you simply look at the elections in December 2005, and then look at the provincial elections of January 2009, and look at the lineup for the elections for January 2010, you can see the progression from starkly sectarian, starkly ethnically based groups, election lists, to a much more diverse group, diverse messages, diverse combinations. Shia now compete against Shia. If Maliki goes in separately and the Iski-led group goes in separately, they will be competing against each other. Similarly, Sunni groups will be competing against Sunni groups. The breakup of the monolithic Kurdish, United Kurdish Front into the KDP, the PUK on the one hand, and the Goran group, which stands for Change, on the other, is not only unprecedented but unexpected, and in fact is probably the most momentous change in Iraqi politics today. So we see a lot of movement in the political process. The open list system is a great advantage for democracy, and the single districts, provinces and single districts, really are moving the political process towards greater transparency, greater accountability. But along with all this, I want to talk about some of the problems that the next government will face. First of all, sectarianism. It's still a political reality. Some of the political groups are trying to disguise it under a new rhetoric. We have new names for political parties that project a more national image. But the sectarian fears, mutual ambition, or conflicting ambitions are still under the surface. And they are still ultimately what governs the relationship between the political groups. If you look at the two major coalitions, the coalition of the Prime Minister Maliki, the state of law, and the coalition that is led by the Supreme Council, they really are Shia groups with token Sunni participation. If you look at all the names that are in there and you look at the platform when they make the announcements, those are Shia parties with only sprinkling of Sunnis. The Tawafuq is an unabashedly Sunni group. The Kurds, of course, run on their own platform, and really the only two lists in the coming elections that can claim to be balanced between Sunni and Shia are the lists of Jawad Boulani, the current Minister of Interior, and Ali Allawi, who was the former Prime Minister. Other than that, you do not have truly balanced Sunni-Shia lists. So sectarianism and all the tensions that arise from it is still an undercurrent, and I think can still undermine the political process, because Sunni and Shia have very different interpretations of what the state should be like, what the identity of the state is. And apropos of this, I don't think talking about a Shia government is very helpful to this process and to reconciliation between Shia and Sunnis and bringing them together on a shared vision of what the state is, because so long as we continue to talk about the Shia government, then we are defining it in sectarian terms, both within Iraq and to the outside world. And I think this is a major problem that the US government ought to be thinking about. Another very threatening element is the weak institutions of the state. More than 6 years after the war and 3.5 years of the current government, Iraq cannot be said to have institutions or a truly functioning state. And the Iraqi people are getting extremely unhappy about this. The voter turnout in January for the provincial elections was merely 51%, which was a great disappointment to the political groups, and really is a signal that the population at large is losing credibility in the state and the functioning of the state. And when I say the state, I don't just mean the Maliki government. I mean the government, the executive branch, and the parliament. there are the trappings of statehood, constitution, elected parliament, and so on, but far greater energy is today invested by the political elite in acquiring and consolidating their own power and prerogatives than in building institutions and ensuring that the parts of the state work together in harmony and as a whole. Most ministries don't function properly. Parliament has been paralyzed over numerous issues and has been extremely unproductive. There is mutual hostility between ministries, between the government and the parliament, and the Prime Minister and the Presidential Council, and this has been a theme for the last 3.5 years. The state really is fairly dysfunctional. There's a lot of ad hoc decision-making, a lot of mismanagement, and nowhere is this lack of institutionalization, the lack of the inability to make things work together and fit in together. Nowhere is it more dangerous than in the security sector. We saw that in the explosions that occurred, the double explosions that occurred in October, there was mutual blaming, mutual recriminations between the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Defense, the Prime Minister's office, and each one of them blamed the other because each one claimed that the job of securing Baghdad was not theirs but belonged to somebody else. This kind of disorganization in the system cannot but undermine the security at times when the insurgency hasn't died out. A third problem is the lack of definition of what the state is, what are its characteristics. There is no common agreement as to what Iraq is. We have a constitution, but the constitution within it carries a clause that says it should be amended. The amendments should have happened a long time ago, and in fact there has been a constitutional review committee functioning for the last 3 years. It presented its last report last June, and yet many of the cardinal issues that divide Iraq have not been resolved either within the Constitution or by the Constitutional Review Committee. There are tensions between provinces and national government, among the provinces themselves, certainly between the national government and the Kurdish regional government. There are problems over either overlapping authorities or undefined authorities. There are tensions in the distribution of resources and so on. And the Kurdish issue, of course, absolutely encapsulates all these question marks about the nature of the Iraqi state. It is a byproduct, although the Kurdish region is recognized by everyone as a federated area within a greater Iraq, but there is no consensus on the degree of federation, the degree of authority, the degree of powers, the distribution of resources between that Kurdish area and the rest of Iraq. But the same is true of all parts of Iraq, including the provinces. There was a provincial powers law that was passed in 2008, and already both the provinces, the provincial councils, and the national government are already looking in that law and saying this is not a sufficiently clear law, that there are areas that still need to be revisited. Somebody has already touched on the question of Iraq's relationship with the region, and first of all, of course, Iran and Turkey are now, there's hardly ever an absence of either Turkish delegations or Iranian delegations, or vice versa. Iraq is going to Turkey and Iran. Whether this constitutes influence, overt, covert, as Ambassador Corbyn said, certainly because of the weak government in Baghdad, there is a power vacuum in Iraq. And this power vacuum will be filled. And there are competing regional agendas that wish to fill that power vacuum, be it Turkey, be it Iran, being some of the GCC countries, notably Saudi Arabia, Syria. The Iraqis often accuse several of these countries of interfering in its affairs, but in the end, until and unless there is a competent and capable Iraqi government, the invitation to interference is always going to be there. Finally, there again is the perception here in Washington that for the moment our attention should be on Afghanistan. But I'd like to posit that in fact the future of the region, of the Middle East region, is not in Afghanistan, but it can be in Iraq. And that the way that Iraq goes is going to determine how this region goes. Well, the impact of what Iraq does or fails to do is going to reverberate through the region in a way that Afghanistan will not necessarily do so. And so the horizon is 2005, I guess, not 2020. But the next government will have a lot of challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ali Allawi.
I'd like to start by thanking the Middle East Institute for inviting me to this panel. I think it was Louis Mayer or somebody like that who said you should not make predictions, especially about the future. But I'll stick my neck out and try to remain true to the title of the panel, which is Iraq 2020. I'm used to be a believer in that history was formed by events, leaders, personalities, and so on. But having gone through the experience of the last few years and even a few decades regarding Iraq, I believe that there are also underlying forces, underlying currents that are equally, if not more important than events designed by policymakers and individuals. These are what the great French historian Brodel called the long duration. And I think this is the format that I'm going to use to try to visualize the kind of Iraq that we may see in 2020. And before we do that, I think I'll spend a few minutes reviewing past decades in Iraq, their beginning and their end, and to see how, in some cases, predictions are based on just events of the moment, and the prescriptions of policy planners lead nowhere. 1950s, Iraq was known as the most advanced developing country in the Middle East. We started with a massive increase in oil revenues. It was part of the Baghdad Pact, the anti-communist pact based on the Iraqi, Turkish, Pakistan, Iranian, and British alliance, backed ultimately by the United States. We ended that decade, or the short decade of the 1950s, with a world-class revolution as far as we were concerned, which eliminated the monarchy, took us out of the Baghdad Pact, and put us firmly into the camp of the neutrals, and for a short time in the camp of the pro-communists. The 1960s were, you could not make any predictions starting from 1960, because Iraq then was, as I said, neutralist, pro-communist, ended up as an Arab nationalist regime dominated by the Ba'ath Party, interspersed with several coups d'etats and attempted coups d'etats. The 1970s, or the long 70s as I call them, was the period where the Ba'athist dictatorship consolidated itself and ended up in one of the great disasters of modern Middle Eastern history, which is the Iran-Iraq War. That decade was dominated by the war, but was then punctuated by another incredible move. So if you started the 1980s thinking that Iraq is going to dominate the Middle East by neutralizing the Iranian Revolution, you ended up with the invasion of Kuwait. And if you started predicting in 1990 what will happen in the year 2000, you had Iraq under sanctions and under international control. And of course, anybody who looked at Iraq in the year 2000 would hardly predict where we are today. So it could be a foolish act, what I'm trying to do. All I'm trying to note here is a side warning of caution, that whatever we may think ought to happen may not necessarily happen. I tried to divide my views on Iraq in terms of number of conceptual categories. One of them relates to, obviously, the political divisions inside the country. We've heard about the terrible nature of sectarianism and how bad it is and so on. Will Iraq be based on, will the basis of politics in 2020 be based on sectarianism, religious politics, a kind of Iraqi nationalism, or a variant of modern liberal democratic thought? If I was going to stick my neck out, I would say no, it will be based on a sectarian affinity. Several decades of democratic politics in Lebanon have not really changed the patterns of voting. I think in Iraq, most Shias will continue to vote for Shias, and most Sunnis will continue to vote for Sunnis, and most Arabs will continue to vote for Arabs, and most Kurds will continue to vote for Kurds. Whether this is done through a monolithic sectarian group or whether through individual groups or parties that focus on sectarian identity, I think it's probably be the latter. It will not be a definitively sectarian, but there will not be a national basis which voters cross ethnic and sectarian boundaries. I find that difficult to see how this would happen. So, for better or worse, the longue durée, as it were, that affected Iraq in 2003 was a fundamental shift in power from one community to the next, if that is how you want to view the progress of Iraqi politics. And many Iraqi politicians, now that this is safely behind us, still view it in these terms. The institutions that have emerged as a result of the 2003 upheaval, are they going to last? I think some of them will. Parliament, parliamentary forms of government, electoral politics, these I think will continue to be the mechanism by which disputes are resolved in Iraq. But whether this means that there is a deep democratic and parliamentary culture that has emerged, again, sticking my neck out, I would say no. Parliament will be a mechanism by which conflicts are resolved and negotiated, but it would not necessarily have a life of its own. Neither will democratic culture and the understanding of it in terms of various institutions, or what Tocqueville called the habits of the heart. This, I think, will be a long, long time before they're inculcated, if at all, into the Iraqi body politic. We may tolerate each other and accommodate each other, but that's a far, far cry from being part of or believing in the ideals of classical liberal democracy. In the area of economics, what kind of economy are we likely to see? Are we likely to see one that is dominated by the state? Are we likely to see a market-driven economy? I would like to see a combination of the two. Again, taking the past as prologue and sticking my neck out, unless there are some very, very important and radical shifts in policy, I believe that Iraq will be a state-dominated economy or a statist economy, where the major elements that constitute an economic order, I mean, apart from the oil sector, which is highly improbable that it would be in any sense or form allowed to be privatized or to have major private players in it. The other aspects of the economy, I think, will continue to be dominated by the state, and the various institutions associated with economic activity will be, I believe, subject to the usual rules of patronage and so on. So, under this general framework, I think there will be a reasonable scope for the private sector, but it will have to operate in an environment that will be dominated by the state-owned organizations and enterprises, and will be an environment which will be tilted definitively in that direction. Will economic policy be any different in the next 10 years than it was in the last 6 or 7 years? And again, unless some dramatic changes are made in the way in which economic policy is projected or transferred to specific rules and regulations and policy decisions, I think, again, it will be one that will be driven by impulse, by short-term needs, by short-term considerations, in spite of the fact that we are part of the World Trade Organization and will be subject to constant pressure from our friends and allies to toe the line. In reality, this has had very little effect in Iraq, and I don't think it will, if you just project the trend line, it will be an economic policy that would be, by and large, one that will respond to the, as it were, the exigencies of the moment. Looking at the security sector, the military, especially the military and the internal security services, will these be able to maintain public order? Well, they have two functions in any state. One is to defend the frontiers, and the other one is to maintain public order in the case of breakdown in civil order. I think they will be able to maintain the external frontiers of the state against any threats that may emanate from whichever country, unless these threats are so overwhelming and so immediate and concern the national security interests of countries like Turkey. I think by and large very few countries will try to attack Iraq as long as the US military is one way or another in the country. So I think willy-nilly, yes, our military will be able to maintain the borders, will be able to maintain and control civil disturbances. I think yes. I believe the state will always have predominance over any single individual group that may arise to threaten it, including a recombined insurgency, which I think is highly improbable anyway. It may be a serious problem if there's a direct confrontation between the state and the Kurdistan regional government. I hope it does not happen, but we're speaking here theoretically. Will the current military disposition allow the government to control serious shifts in regional and national frontiers? Probably not. There was, I think there will be utmost will be done to avoid such a likelihood. Will the security services do their job of finding out the actions of insurgents, of malefactors, of all kinds of people who are trying to disrupt and destroy the political order? I think yes. They're becoming more and more adept at that. I think they're learning quite a lot in terms of modern security and interrogation methods. And in spite of the flaws and faults of the last few months, in time, I think they are growing. However, we have several of them now. We have one security service that's by and large related to countermanding, as it were, threats coming from Iran. We have one security service that is connected to the Prime Minister's office. We have one that's connected to the military. We have one that's connected to the Ministry of Interior. So depending on the strength of these institutions, these will wax and wane as to what their priorities are. Will we have a national security service in 2020 that will obey the instructions of the government and abide by the Constitution in ways that happens in most modern countries? I would say yes and no. They will still be subject to local pressures and local threats. But the trend line there, I think, is in the right direction. In terms of Iraq's international relations, how will these relationships look like? Well, there are several key actors here, and each one of them, I think, has a profound influence on the future course of events in Iraq. The most important, obviously, that's non-regional, is the United States. Will the Iraqi relationship with the United States be along the lines in which it is envisaged in the security agreement? In the non-military side, non-security side, I would say yes. In the sort of softer areas of economic, cultural, and social interchange and so on, I think yes, this is probably one of the cornerstones, I think, of that one can build on. And I can envisage a country in 2020 that has a large number of, for example, graduates who came from the United States, large number of non-governmental organizations, large number of cultural offices and exchanges. So that relationship, at least at the cultural level, will be maintained, if not strengthened. With Iran, how will Iran's relationship with Iraq be? I think it's to do with the general pattern in which Iraq is going to resolve its regional issues. Whether we're going to continue to act as a one-off partner in the area, where we try to weave ourselves in a broader way into a larger economic framework and political framework that would include countries like Turkey, Iran, even Syria, and possibly the GCC. If something like that evolves as in the manifest interests of the countries of the area, then perhaps we will be able to create a regional economic confederation that will transcend the current limitations that we have. Will this happen in 2020? I think the odds are possibly in that direction. We see greater interest, obviously, on the part of Turkey to reconfigure its power base in the Middle East. Iran also has, I think, whether with or without the current structure of government, an important economic and political relationship with Iraq that must not be ignored. There are other factors that will have I'll come to a conclusion here. There are other factors here, I think, that are at work that have not been looked at. One of them is the age of the population. We have a very, very young population. We have also a rapidly growing population that has been very badly impoverished. Per capita income in Iraq in real terms in the year 1978 was nearly $3,000, about 3 times what it is now. So we've had a real diminution of people's incomes and stature. Ultimately, of course, a lot depends on the flow of oil and whether the current agreements that we've entered into or subsequent agreements have the potential of doubling Iraq's oil every 4 years. If that happens, then one of the important and critical bottlenecks that can stop us from achieving a more benign environment in 2020, which is the financial state of the country, I think will be resolved. Lastly, I think in the terms of state-periphery relationship, will Iraq be a centralized state with a powerful central government and weak provincial authorities? The answer, I think, is no. I think we've already have moved into a decentralized level, but not one which would lead to the replication of the Kurdistan arrangements in other parts of Iraq. But we are more of a federal state, and I think we'll continue to be that in 2020. There are other issues that I don't have time to talk about, but this is the general frame. Thank you very much.
We have about 15 minutes for questions, and lots of them. A lot of them are bunched around external neighborly influence. We had a panelist in our last panel who announced that Kuwait would be participating in the Iraq election. Let me ask both Mr. Dobbins and Ren, your assessment of outside interference, what makes you think that Syria will interfere in Iraq on behalf of the Sunnis is one questioner asks, and about Turkey's role after the U.S. withdrawal.
Well, I think Iran's behavior is likely to be more a function of its relations with the United States than its interest in Iraq. Its interest in Iraq are not inconsistent with those of the United States, or, for that matter, inconsistent with those of Iraq. It wants a unified Iraq, albeit not a particularly strong or challenging Iraq. That's what it has at the moment, and there's no particular reason to destabilize it unless Iran decides to do so for reasons that revolve around their relations with the U.S. And so the degree to which tensions with the U.S. increase over extraneous issues, the nuclear issue being the principal one likely to intensify conflict, will be the most important determinant of Iranian behavior over the next few years as it relates to Iraq. In terms of Turkey, it will be the behavior of the Kurds, both on the PKK and also on the border region, and the minorities in the border region that would be most likely to provoke some kind of intervention. So I think those are the dangers. They're not insurmountable, and it's not inevitable that there will be intolerable levels of interference, but it's certainly possible.
Brent?
Yeah, I would differ with that slightly because I think a lot has to do with the way that Iran and Turkey see themselves in the region. In other words, the way they define their role in the region. I don't think that, for example, for Turkey, the only issue in Iraq is the Kurds. It used to be at a certain point, but we've seen Turkey evolve politically, and we've seen it redefine its regional role. And I think, therefore, its relationship with Iraq will transcend or go beyond its interest in the Kurds. Similarly, Iran sees a role for itself in the region that is not only connected with the U.S., much broader. And so they will continue to have an interest in Iraq beyond the narrower interest. And by the way, I mean, those who know history know that Iraq and Baghdad in particular was throughout the 16th and 17th century subject to waves of invasions, successive invasions from Persia at one time, Turkey on the other, at the other time, and it would change hands all the time. The other thing to point out in all of this is that because over the last several years, since 2003, Iraq has not clearly defined itself as an Arab state, for example. Not that I'm suggesting it needs to, but in the past there was always a host, there was always a context for Iraq, which was the Arab world. And that tended to slightly sort of ease off possibly Iranian pressure or Turkish pressure and so on. But now Iraq does not necessarily recognize its Arabness and its belonging to an Arab world, and that makes the regional influences and agendas much sharper. They come into much sharper focus.
There's a series of questions on the issue of corruption. I'd like to ask both Michael Corbin and Ali Allawi. Transparency International has named Iraq third from the bottom. But it's also endemic. You want a passport, it's $300 to the guy behind the desk. It's not just institutional, it is across the board. I wondered if both of you can speak to you generally said it was an issue of free press and the judiciary. How long do we wait for that, and is it already in place before that happens?
Just quickly, it's about a free press that's willing to publicize these cases. It's about a judiciary that's willing to present cases about them, and it's about a government that's willing to actually prosecute them. This is where I think that institutions in Iraq are developing. The Council of Representatives is taking on its role of calling ministers who are accused of corruption. There's lots more to do. Iraq has a tradition of a fairly independent judiciary. I think there's a basis to work with there. I think this will be a focus that we have to work on, and I think Iraq may be ahead of some other countries in the region in terms of what we have to work with to address this issue.
Ali Allawi?
I'm afraid I slightly disagree, because I think corruption in Iraq is really institutionalized in the sense that it's part and parcel of whatever you want to do with the government. The fact of the matter is that a lot of especially the larger cases of corruption, were exposed by the press. A lot of the actors were known, but there was neither a political will to bring them to task, nor, might I add, and the international environment that helped or that supported the Iraqi desire to bring these people to justice. The scale of corruption in some of the ministries really goes beyond the normal 5% or whatever it is that people charge in commissions. It goes into theft of state assets and entire budgets. And to some extent, this is so interwoven with the political parties and with the power structures that it's very, very difficult, I think, except when the thing becomes so obvious and so immediately tangible, as what happened in the case of the corruption in the Ministry of Trade. It is institutionalized because in the past, although the state was corrupt in the Saddam period, it basically managed the corruption. And there was a very powerful force called the security forces, which if people did not toe the line as to how much they could take, they were sanctioned. This is gone. And the various institutions that manage the process of uncovering corrupt practices and so on are themselves infiltrated and subverted. And the government constantly changes tacks as to how to manage and to go after those who indulge in these practices. So I think it will stay with us for some time to come.
Let me ask the panel in general, is there a place for high-ranking Ba'athist members of the former regime, such as diplomats or ministers not accused of human rights abuses, to take part in politics? I suppose we should start with the two Iraqis.
Well, there are two levels to this. First of all, in the Constitution, the Ba'ath Party is banned. So I think that somebody who's running under the banner of the Ba'ath Party would not be able to run for anything. But the other part of it is that the de-Ba'athification law has been replaced by the accountability and whatever, amnesty and accountability. And I believe in it, the people who have not committed crimes can participate in government. I think above a certain rank they can't, but they can retire. They can be pensioned off. Below a certain rank, and that rank is fairly high, they can participate in anything they wish. Now, that is the sort of de jure part of it. But in fact, I think the Ba'athis are still regarded, even if they were low-ranking and so on, they're still regarded as very suspect. They are, I'm sure that they would be hounded out of office, out of their jobs. So the reality, the laws and the reality don't necessarily match.
I think the underlying premise of this question is that those who came after 2003 don't have the necessary qualifications and the gravitas, as it were, to run the state. And we had this cadre of people whose only fault was that they joined the Ba'ath Party. Otherwise, they were incredibly competent. And I personally don't believe that. I mean, the high Ba'athist officials, some of them were good, some of them were not, like what we have after the invasion. Nevertheless, a lot of Ba'athis, and some of them extremely high-ranking, managed to infiltrate the political process by joining political parties, and their sins were forgiven. I mean, I remember when I was in the government, there were several incidents of very, very high-level Ba'athists who, for one reason or another, were exempted from from the de-Ba'athification measures. So it's not really hard and fast rule that if you're a senior Ba'athist, somehow or another, you're not allowed to enter into political practice unless your livelihood is, as it were, your iron bowl is broken. This is not the case, I think. With that in mind, I still maintain that these people were working for a state that by and large put us into 2 wars and was responsible for the invasion or creating the circumstances by which our country was invaded. So I can't, by any standard, see why they should be allowed to misgovern the country again.
Do you have anything to add, and if not?
Well, I do think that the scale of de-Ba'athification has been somewhat exaggerated in popular imagination, popular perception. The de-Ba'athification process affected 1% of Ba'ath Party members. In other words, only 1 in 100 of Ba'ath Party members were affected, which meant it was 0.1% of the population as a whole. In other words, 1 person in 1,000. So it was far less sweeping than it is generally appeared to be. In gross numbers, the numbers were fairly high. Several tens of thousands of officials lost their positions. Unlike denazification, where a much higher percentage, 25 times higher percentage, not only were banned from public office, they were banned from anything except manual labor, whereas in Iraq they were only banned from public office and could hold any other profession they chose. So the numbers, the total numbers were more limited than generally appreciated. In fact, the total numbers were probably not very different than the number of officials that change jobs when Democrats replace Republicans in this country if you had all state, local, and federal elections at the same time. And then the turnover in patronage positions would be on a somewhat similar scale. It's not unusual that the new politicians, like Mr. Allawi, who took office in 2003, would expect to find positions in the administration for their supporters rather than Saddam's. That's how our system works, and it's certainly how other systems that are even more patronage-driven than ours work, and so I'm afraid that we're going to have to largely live with those consequences, whether or not there may have been some degree of unfairness with respect to individuals.
We've got time for about one more question, and I'd like to start with Michael Corbin for this one, and that is that this conference opened with an American ambassador criticizing this administration by saying we're not paying enough attention to Iraq, that Afghanistan has sucked all of our resources away, and that we are in danger of not paying enough attention. Do you find any truth in that criticism?
I think we'll always be criticized. I think that's why this transition from a security-based relationship to a relationship based on a broader partnership is so important. I think President Obama made very clear in his Camp Lejeune speech that we do have a commitment to Iraq, and we are committed through 2012 with the military, and then beyond that in terms of the Strategic Framework Agreement. So we will face this criticism. It's something that we will work with all the time, but we think that we have partners in the Iraqis who want to work on institution building and on the economy principally.
Jim Donovan?
I just add, I mean, we still have twice as many troops, almost twice as many troops in Iraq as we do in Afghanistan. We certainly have a much larger number of diplomats and civilians in Iraq than we do in Afghanistan. So while there certainly has been a shift in public attention, and probably a shift in attention by the President and his principal advisors in terms of where they're spending their time, I don't think it's yet translated into a shift in resources. I do think there's one area where I'm slightly critical of the administration, and that is that I don't see enough attention being paid to the regional aspects of stabilizing Iraq. You know, we've got a special envoy for Afghanistan. He spends a lot of time talking to Pakistan, talking to China, talking to and trying to talk to Iran, and engaged in regional diplomacy designed to promote convergent pressures on the Afghans from regional powers who have influence. And I don't think we're doing enough of that with respect to Iraq. It's not a job that Chris Hill can do from Baghdad. And while I'm not sure this administration needs yet another czar, it is a job that at the moment is going begging.
Ren, does this administration need to do more in a country that you called anything but normal?
Well, first of all, I would agree with James Dobbins that there isn't a go-to person on Iraq, and the Vice President is not. You really can't think of the Vice President as the go-to person. I mean, he's got other things. So I think something like that would be helpful, and I do think that more diplomatic engagement. For example, let me just go back. On this Strategic Framework Agreement, which was signed in late 2008, very little was done. And none of the committees that were supposed to be set up and functional actually were functioning. At one point, they eliminated the Political Diplomatic Committee. It's only with the most recent trip of the Prime Minister here, that something began to move forward and the Strategic Framework Agreement began to be implemented. And this is not just for a lack of interest on the Iraqi side. I think there was a lack of attention also on the American side. And as I say, I do believe that the future of the region, that certainly the Middle East proper, is highly dependent on which way Iraq goes. And therefore, I think it behooves the United States to be more engaged.
Allawi, you have the last word.
I mean, I think somewhat differently. That I think the United States military presence in Iraq, in terms of its fighting al-Qaeda, fighting insurgents, and acting as a stabilizing element internally, should come to an end. I think it is no longer. We are now in a different phase in the political culture of the country in the post-2003 period. The first one started in 2003 and ended at sometime around 2007. And the presence of the United States military may, of course, help in terms of controlling extreme bouts of violence. But it will also stop, I think, the Iraqi security services themselves from becoming more directly engaged in this process. Nevertheless, I think if the United States wants to maintain its role and have some kind of return, as it were, on this investment that they've made in Iraq and life and treasure, it's far, far better done and exercised in the soft areas. And here I don't mean just diplomatic and political, but in terms of cultural and economic support, especially economic support, where a large part of the stabilization of the country and turning it into a modern state is going to rest. So the U.S. should really change gears, and it may be already be doing that without actually articulating it, so that the military presence is then phased out within President Obama's time frame and replaced by a far more, I would say, benign but focused set of activities in institution building and in the economic area. If that happens, I think the U.S. will be relatively secure in terms of the return on its engagement with Iraq. And Iraq will be not just a long-term ally because of the military aspects of it, but an ally because of a set of interwoven and interconnecting interests.
Thank you very much, and thank you, audience, for being so patient. We're a little over time. Time for coffee.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, distinguished panelists. We have coffee outside. Our break is a 10-minute coffee break. We'll be starting at 3:35. The last panel. We're selling books in the Holman Room next door, as well as copies of our journal.
So a break now in today's Middle East Institute Forum. The next panel in about 15 minutes, 3:35 p.m. Eastern Time, on domestic political obstacles to Arab-Israeli peace, getting started about 5 minutes later than the scheduled time, as you just heard a moment or two ago. Until then, we'll show you a State Department briefing from earlier. Secretary